all the way to sort of the other side of the mating pool where you are interested in marrying, right? Whereas in the old mating pool, everybody who was participating, I mean, prostitution was outside of the mating pool, okay? Everybody who was having sex was dealing with the question of the security and commitment level in their relationship. And now you have choices, right? So this market is split into different corners. Now people can have one-night stands or short-term relationships, friends with benefits, whatever you want to call them. Some people will have committed sexual relationship, but they're not sure exactly where it's going, etc. It's fine for now. They may live together, maybe not. Or you can be interested in marrying, right? So that people who have sex in this mating pool still might think, yeah, but I want it to serve marital ends, like in the old mating pool, okay? But now people have lots of choices. So the thing is, this mating pool is split by gender distinctions, right? So more men are over here. I mean, I can go in and explain that to you, but you probably get the gist of that, right? And as a result, more women are over here, right? It takes men a little bit longer both to marry and to commit and to sacrifice, etc. On average, not every man. But it means different people can be interested in different things, right? But what happens, I'll go back to that slide in a second, but if you'd show me the next slide. What happens in those early relationships? I take a focus on power in early relationships, right? We don't talk about power relationships when you're married much. I mean, I suppose you could. But a settled marriage doesn't usually have power issues like an early relationship does, right? And you tend to think, like, who has the power? The person who wants it less, so to speak, right? If they're in this relationship together, who wants it more feels like they're in a more vulnerable spot, typically speaking, right? So power within relationships, which central principle is what we call the sex ratio hypothesis, is not just determined by things like how much status the person has, how physically attractive they are, because that matters more for men, typically speaking, than women. It also depends on the surrounding market characteristics. That's the focus I tend to take, is sort of what are the social aspects of the mating market, right? Not just sort of, how attractive is she? We'll say, oh, she is so out of his league. We'll make a remark about she seems like she is dipping down in terms of attractiveness or something like that, right? Well, women do that more than men do on average, right? But I don't care as much about the kind of those interpersonal things. I care more about like the social things, right? Dependency. What's going on in the market, the mating pool around you, right? So my question really is like, what happens when men are rare versus what happens when women are rare, okay? If you go back to that first slide, not the first, the one just before it. Can you go backwards? Right? What happens when women are rare over here, and what happens when men are rare over here? Okay? Next slide once more. We have to ask the question of what do they want? What are their preferences? What are men's preferences and what are women's preferences? Right? And so when women, back to that other side once more, back when women are rarer, they have more power, okay? They're less dependent on men, okay? So I use, in Austin, I use the example of 6th Street, right? I mean, people go to bars, men and women, men hit on women, but if a woman is interested in sex, she has plenty of opportunity, right? There are more men interested in her that night than women interested in men, okay? Meanwhile, on the other end of the corner, you have more women interested in marrying at any given point in time, certainly in the church, but even outside the church, and fewer men, okay? So, next slide again, please. This makes the mating market subject to a great deal of guesswork in a way that the old mating market was not, so to speak, right? So now, and I'll fast forward a little bit to online dating, right? When people are talking about their profiles in online dating, they'll say things like, I'm ready for a real relationship, right? Go back to that last slide once more. Where are you if you say, I am ready for a real relationship? Are you over here? Are you here? Where are you? You're somewhere over in this direction, looking for fun. I'm looking for fun. I'm like, no. Right? I mean, people signal where they are at in the mating market because they have to, because the contemporary mating market is subject to a great deal of confusion, a lot more confusion than it did once. And people feign things, like they act like they're interested, and then you've come to find out they're really not, right? So this mating market has issues, we could say. It's subject to a great deal of guesswork, but it also recognizes that people's interests are connected to their position in the mating market, right? Now, this may look like a recipe for women saying that men are afraid of commitment, okay? Men are afraid of commitment because they're not as many of them over here. I actually don't think men are afraid of commitment. And I took a step out on faith to say that a few years ago when I was working on this book, and I still believe it's true today. I don't think men are afraid of commitment. In fact, sometimes I hear men are quick to commit, okay, once they've found the right person. I think men are not afraid of commitment. The deal is they are in charge of how the mating market operates, right? This is conducted to their interests. This fits their interests better than it fits women's interests. Okay, skip forward a couple slides, please. So what is the deal? One more. The thing that has changed, and the thing that's the focus of the book, is technology. Now, we could go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, right? And I can talk, which I don't really in the book, but with the Industrial Revolution, the idea and purpose and role of children changed, right? So I can't come along and say that the pill is the only thing that has kind of plunged fertility. Fertility was dropping well before the pill. Fertility dropped significantly between 1800 and 1900, almost in half, right? Women on average had about 7 children in 1800. They had a little under 4 by 1900, and now they have, half of that, a little under 2. So the cost of children rise because children become net consumers rather than producers. So lots of us have read or have read to our children the Little House on the Prairie series. You get the idea that how children on the farm make things, right? They don't really do that quite anymore, right? They consume the things that you give them, right? And you try to get them to do chores, anything. But definitely it's true that children are a net consumer, in a sense, and rather than producers. And that makes a difference, right? But I don't focus much on the Industrial Revolution. I focus on 3 technologies whose advent is in the past roughly 50 years. All 3 of which have kind of diminished the cost of sex. The pill, pornography, and online dating. And I'll go and talk about those in order, right? But my framework for this tends to be not that I think, the culture is rotting, okay? I think the culture has problems, right? But there's cultures, there's subcultures. I actually think technology drives what we eventually see in changes in culture and attitudes, etc. That is sort of more, this being the structural side, and that being like, this is downstream from it, right? Like politics is downstream from technology and culture. So how do I know that the cost of sex has diminished? Because I talk about the price of sex in the book, which seems very crude to think of it like that. There are other ways to think of it, other good ways to think of it, to consult the catechism, etc. But this is also happening, right? Sex is priced. It can be priced high, it can be priced low, and somewhere in between. Next slide, please. Right, this I pulled from just a snapshot of a chapter in the book. This is the time to sexual initiation or first sex with your current sexual partner. It could be your spouse. Okay, we asked this of everybody in the data. Men are darker colored, women are the lighter colored here. When in your current relationship or your most recent relationship, and it may be the person you were married to, did you first have sex with that person? Okay? And we gave them options from the day you met all the way down to after we got married, which, I'm kind of guessing is more than a year after you met, but it could overlap here. But most of the people can see that this is a distinctive answer, okay? So the modal answer now, the most frequently cited, is after we met, but before we were in a relationship, okay? And then think about combining that second row with the third and the fourth rows, and you're talking about, this is like 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 percentage, right? Each line is 5%, I'm sorry. No matter which way I show it, the percentages, you've got them up there, okay, good. 0, 5, 10. So you group those three together, and you've got like 40 to 50% of relationships initiate sex within the first 2 weeks of their commencement. Which means, this is, I think, the purest measure of how cheap sex is, right? Because in the background of this thesis is that sex is more of a woman's resource than a men's resource. And that can ruffle feathers, I know that. I apologize for it, I guess. I don't know. But it's just true, right? Women do not pay men to have sex. Some men will pay women to have sex. Some men will pay men to have sex. But women will not pay anybody for sex, right? That's not how they roll, which is a good thing. It's also unnecessary, right? Because there are plenty of willing men, always. So, when we map this, we get a sense of just how cheap sex is out there, right? Because the longer it takes in a relationship development, the more expensive we're talking about that it is, right? It's not the only way of measuring cheap sex, but it is probably the best way of measuring it, right? So we're talking about a fairly low price for sex, okay? All right, but I was talking about contraception. So contraception is kind of the key thing that sinks the price of sex. It takes fertility, if used properly, out of the equation, right? And so with the advent of it and the uptake, which really starts in the 70s, you start to see a drag on the formation of committed relationships, namely marriage. All right, next slide, please. The weird thing about contraception is we hear plenty about it today, but if it was so effective, why are 41% of births today in the United States non-marital? Well, it's just not that hard to figure out, right? Because the first thing that happens with the advent and uptake is that marital fertility declines because it was designed for married couples. They were the only ones who had access to it until the Supreme Court said, no, that's not fair. So marital fertility declines, but then when everybody gets access to this, premarital sex starts to explode, starts to skyrocket, and yet at the same time, these things have standard failure rates, which you know about. There's the average, or there's normal use, and then there's perfect use. But we talk about normal use because it's normal. Perfect use is not normal. And normal use failure rates are higher than people tend to think, right? So this is how we get to a place where lots of births are non-marital. All right, so there's a decent section of the book that I talk about sort of the effect of the pill on the price of sex. Now, what about pornography? I have one slide on this. The next one, please. Right? I talk about this as a low-cost alternative to sex, right? So the chapter 4 begins by talking about pornography as like the cheapest form of sex, really. Because digital pornography today more closely mimics the real thing than it did in our grandparents' era, right? So we asked men and women from age 18 to 60, 15,000 people, when did you last intentionally use pornography? Because the way you ask the question matters. Also, when you ask it in the survey, you have to ask these kinds of questions at the end, otherwise you lose a bunch of people. But if you've established rapport, then you stick the sensitive questions at the end, and you get, you don't get much response bias at that point, which is nice. So, at all ages, this is weekly use. We asked them, did you look at this today, yesterday, 2 to 4 days ago, 5 to 6 days ago, 1 to 2 weeks ago, blah, 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 never. And so we grouped together everybody that was up to 5 to 6 days ago, right? I call it past week, but it's actually technically a little bit under a week. And so this is the case with men and women in America today. But I'm not so interested in sort of use rates by themselves. So people can look at this and be shocked or not shocked. And my curiosity, my interest is like, how does this affect the mating market, right? How does it affect how people get together, right? Because typically, when pornography is a problem, it's because somebody has a problem with somebody else's use of it, okay? And it causes friction, et cetera, and tension, and anger, and hurt, and pain, and there's sometimes counseling, and et cetera. But that's like people interpersonally dealing with it in a relationship. I'm interested in, what does this do to the whole playing field, so to speak, right? This is weird, because I quoted Naomi Wolf in the book. She's a fairly well-known feminist. She wrote about pornography in 2003 or 2004 in I think it's a New York magazine. And she used economic language, which is rather something. She said, "For 2 decades, I have watched young women experience the continual mission creep of how pornography, and now internet pornography, has lowered their sense of their own sexual value and their actual sexual value," right? It's interesting. Like, so Naomi Wolf, this sort of feminist critic, talks about like value, which is an economic term, their sense of their sexual value, and then their kind of real objective sexual value. She said, when I came of age in the 70s, it was still pretty cool to be able to offer a young man the actual presence of a naked, willing young woman. There were more young men who wanted to be with naked women than there were naked women on the market. Okay? It's kind of weird. She's talking this market language, right? Well, she said, I am 40, 10, 15 years ago, and mine is the last female generation to experience the sense of sexual confidence and security in what we had to offer. And she's right. Women are entirely right when they think or they perceive that pornography creates competition. Okay? So women will lament, like, I can never look like that, I can never do that, etc., I never want to. But what it is competition, right, for his attention. And it lowers the price of real sex for women because they feel like now they have to compete. And how do you compete with something? You have to undercut the price. When there's competition, price lowers, which is frustrating in this domain. So she said, the young women who talk to me on campuses about the effect of pornography on their intimate lives speak of feeling that they can never measure up, that they can never ask for what they want, and that if they do not offer what porn offers, they cannot expect to hold on to a guy. Okay? I had an interaction. So I wrote a section of this, appeared in the Wall Street Journal last September, a little clip of the book. And then it went the way of the dodo until somehow it got revived a couple weeks ago. I don't know how, but it had a Facebook life. And I heard from some people, critics, but a friend of mine who's an evangelical minister in Austin, she's in her mid-30s, has not married, and she sort of lamented, like, I am not going to cheapen myself, but you know what? It is a detriment to me in the mating market. She's like, I am not going to do this, but man, it's getting harder to find somebody who doesn't insist, right? So, Naomi Wolf says this is a problem. Men tend to disagree. They think, there's no competition. I'm willing to be with you too. And believe, these are just images, right? But she wants his monogamous attention, not just his monogamous human being interaction, right? So men and women tend to think differently on this subject. But the problem is that it affects the mating pool and the market dynamics, even if women don't use it, or even if men don't use it, it's like it's kind of in the water, so to speak now. It affects things. All right, next slide, please. The third technology. This is where I pick on people who don't deserve to be picked on, right? I talk about online dating as a price suppressor, something that also lowers the price of sex. Now, some of you met online. I'm not going to criticize that. It's one of those things like, unlike pornography, this can actually be used for good, right? And it's kind of a key way by which people come to meet and find each other today. At the same time, I also think like the underlying logic of online dating is problematic and probably unreformable, so to speak. We can kind of use it, and so people will often say, like eHarmony, started by Fuller Seminary psychology professor. It's, they ask lots of different questions. They care about spirituality and religiousness and religious fit, and they want to make as many marriages happen as possible. Fine, great, okay? The problem is, like, the underlying logic of how online dating works does not create marriages, okay? Well, if it did, if it was successful, back to our little slide here, right? This wouldn't be happening, right? I mean, when did online dating really kick in? Okay, this is the year 2000, right? Well, it's not making things any better, and it could be making things potentially worse. But it's not going anywhere. Like, pornography is not going anywhere. So these are just realities we have to navigate, right? But what are my problems with it, right? Well, a handful of things, right? First of all, speed, right? Speed lets you decipher through lots of people quickly, okay? You might think, well, that's good, that's efficient, right? But then rewind to the era when you had to do this very slowly, right? You had a more circumscribed dating pool. There was not hundreds and hundreds of people in it. There's probably a dozen or two, okay, that were legitimate possibilities, and maybe not even that many, right? So when you have speed, it focuses on only those traits that can be discerned immediately. How attractive is he or she? And maybe I can discern something about wealth, status, even though that matters more to some people than to others. So it doesn't really deal with the whole person. You have to get to know them, to talk to them, in order to find that out. So there's nothing about the technology that sort of esteems the larger perspective of a person. So you get ruled out or in, I'll talk to you or I won't talk to you, just by what you look like, right? You know nothing of me, or I know nothing of you, but I've already decided that you're not good enough for me, or you are good enough for me, right? But men swipe, is it right? A lot more than women swipe right? And anybody heard of Bumble? What's the deal with Bumble? Somebody tell me what the deal is with Bumble. What's different about it? Anybody? Women initiate it, right? So why do we create Bumble? So that women can initiate it, the conversation? We create it because it means that the whole system of online dating is built for men, okay? Because it is. So Bumble is kind of this reaction to it. Like, let's try to make it so that women can take the first step, right? And frankly, like Tinder, I didn't think Tinder would work out, but it has. But it's because women have used it kind of to their advantage a little bit, right? It means like they don't have to talk to you, right? And Bumble goes a little bit further and like, I can look, you don't even get to see me. I get to see you first, right? So far as I can tell. Right. So it means that not just the mating market, but even the online dating scene is dominated by men's interests. It highlights efficiency, so it intensifies this sort of the challenges that are already going on in the mating market. It makes those a little bit worse, right? So the interested in sex corner of the mating market, right? We know that online dating feeds into that, okay? Feeds into that a heck of a lot quicker and more profoundly than it does feed into the interested in marriage side of the mating market. it diminishes interest in solving what we call upfront investment costs, right? So I met my wife in 1989, before all this, in college, where I thought there was like one other girl who was potentially interested in me on campus, right? So my pool was 2, okay, right? So as all relationships do, like you have problems, I don't know, not that long after you begin a relationship. You have some conflict. Social interaction breeds conflict. It's like a guarantee. And so I think now it's like, because we broke up 3 times in college. And I tell the story in the book about how after a second or third time we broke up, probably the second, I don't remember. She went on a date with a friend of hers who was also a student at the school, and I knew who he was, and I was irritated like that, she would go out on a date so soon after we were through. I mean, this is just unacceptable post-relationship behavior. But it made me sit and think about, like, this bothers me that she's doing this. Why am I doing it? Why am I fretting about this relationship, right? I mean, I've sunk a lot of time into it. We're 2 years in already, at least 2 years. I mean, are these problems soluble? What's my deal, right? And that other girl, do I really feel like going out with her and starting over? I mean, I was only 20 or 21 at the time, like not that old to start over, but I had already put in lots of investment time in this particular person, okay? So, fast forward to today, right? If I'm online at age 20, 21, 22, right? And I'm on Match or whatever, and I have a bad first date or a bad second date or a bad third date, whatever. And then I go and look, who else is interested in me, right? And then I make up things about them in my head without even knowing them. Like, oh, I bet you they're totally not like my ex-girlfriend, right? So it diminishes interest in solving problems early in relationships. It means you swap out, right? I mean, in some ways, it helps you figure out how to leave, right? Which is ultimately downstream a problem, okay? So speed and efficiency are consonant with a kind of approach to relationships that fosters a short-term mentality to them, and it doesn't foster how to work through problems. Okay, next slide. So basically, 2 things are fundamentally altering the mating market and its post-pill dynamics. One is that women are increasingly successful, and frankly, no small part because of the access to the pill, right? I mean, you don't have to be on the pill to have benefited from the pills helping women of all sorts complete more education, okay? I'm not ashamed to say that. Socially, I don't see how I can't say that, right? Because in the pre-pill era, we would be either a lot more chaste, or we'd have babies, and people wouldn't get through college, or they wouldn't get through graduate school. That's just the reality of it, right? At the same time, you're seeing men's generalized decreasing success, okay? And there was an exchange. She got fertility control, and he got control over the timing of first sex in the relationship. Because if you go back to that one slide, which I'm not going to ask you to do, but the timing of first sex, you don't have sex before you're in a relationship because you're a woman and that's really, really, really what you want to do. You do it because he wants to do it, and you're feeling somewhat vulnerable, right? And maybe this will generate something, right? So it's a signal of men's domination of the market. And how can they dominate the market in sex and marriage? Because fertility control was given to her, not on purpose, by the creation of the pill, etc. So she can acquire a career. In exchange, he gets control over how the relationship develops, right? And so back to that first slide, which I won't go, like relationships develop more slowly now. All right, next slide. So what we are seeing now in terms of marriage is a deinstitutionalization of it. It happens later. On average, I think it's 27 for women, 29 for men. We're moving towards 28 and 30. 28 for women, 30 for men. Its practical importance has declined because women no longer need it, right? They want it, but they don't need it, and that's a big difference. Okay? My grandmothers needed it. Culturally, economically, they needed it. They put up with some things that my one grandmother put up with things that she probably wouldn't have put up with today, right? So there's a lot more women today will say it's worse to be in a bad marriage than to be in no marriage at all, right? And you have the kind of the ability to say that because you have education and careers, right? So people are pickier, women are pickier, and so marriageability of men is no longer just about like, can he hold down a job and not beat me, right? Marriageability is a lot more intense today, right? It has to do with like, what's our political fit? How do we see the world in the same ways, right? And there's a lot more criteria. And frankly, men are failing in some of those criteria, right? So marriage has become, instead of a foundation, which it was in the pre-pill era, something you enter in a little earlier when you're poorer to build something together, it is now in our mind a capstone. It's the sign of a well-lived young adulthood. After you finished college, started work, built a career, getting it running, etc. You've got some money, something to show off. Then you can start thinking about like this symbolic accomplishment. Okay, it's the symbol of successful development, right? I have Maslow over here, just to show you that, like, basically, this was marriage when it was foundation. It was something that most of the people did earlier in life to build and accomplish things on. And now, like, we do those things by ourselves, and then we cap it off with marriage in the late 20s, early 30s, or later, okay? So one of the things that sociologists talk about is cultural lag, okay? Cultural lag. When one part of culture changes faster than another, typically in the form of technology. Next slide, please. I think contraception has contributed to this cultural lag, which typically comes by way of technology, because contraception is not just another technology making something more efficient. Online dating makes the search for a spouse more efficient. Downloading a book onto your phone to listen to that's making more efficient my time between here and Austin. I can actually read a big tome by listening to it. But it fundamentally has not changed. I mean, this person is speaking, or I'm reading it and listening to the voice in my head when I'm reading this book. Same thing with music. I can download singles now instead of albums. All of these things sort of don't do what the pill did for fertility, right? Contraception is not just making the mundane things that we all do a little bit more efficient. It's preventing this socially and personally seismic event from occurring, right? A child, 18 plus years of commitment, your heart, etc. I mean, that's profoundly, it's profound in its magnitude, right? So when we apply this to marriage, we start to see cultural lag come in with contraception, right? Why did people marry in the old mating pool? Well, quite often because there was a baby on the way. Probably, I think more than half of pregnancies in the late 1800s, early 1900s, had a baby on the way, okay? That's no longer the case, typically speaking, right? And I start the book with a long story about a woman in Austin who's in her mid-30s now, who's had 20-plus partners in her life and never had a pregnancy scare, right? Which is kind of stunning in some ways, right? The separation between, like, sex and the idea that babies come from sex, right? So when I apply this to marriage, this cultural lag becomes visible. Marrying, why do people marry anymore? We should really be asking this question, right? Why do people marry? That's somewhat of the subject of my next book. Many people are marrying because they're still following the cultural practices of their parents and their grandparents. Even though the long-standing compelling reasons to marry, things like babies on the way, financial security, the foundation, building something together, I need support, right? You're kicked out of the house at 18 because there was 12 of you. I can't feed you anymore. Go thrive, right? I mean, why did people marry? Because they needed to survive, right? Or they desired a socially legitimate sexual relationship, okay? And prostitution was not something they could do for long, okay? Or they didn't want to do it at all. Right? So all these reasons why people would marry in the past are gone. Babies aren't coming anymore, right? You don't need his economic protection or his physical protection. We have police now and handguns, okay? And alarm systems and all sorts of things, right? People aren't marrying, but it's in no small part because contraception slows this process down because this desire to unite with another person no longer is productive. It's consumptive. Okay, last slide and a half. So this is evidence. This is going to appear in my next book, which is called The Future of Christian Marriage. Although this is not about Christian marriage, this is just UN data for different countries. It's not just in the U.S. that it's slowed down, right? The percentage of people who have ever married, this is women between the ages of 25 to 29. Why do I put that up there? Because fertility starts a slow decline after that. Not a fast decline, but so in all these countries, some of which we equate with quite secular values, the Netherlands, 81% of women by age 29 were married in 1980, 81, right? Lots of us were alive back then. That wasn't that far back in the past, for crying out loud, right? Now 80.6 is 25%, 23% in Sweden. Sweden was the only one that was already starting to get pretty low. Spain goes from 78% down to 24%. The age at first marriage from the 90s to the mid-90s to the mid-teens climbs on average 3 to 6 years in some of these places. I mean, this is cultural lag in full view. Okay, finally, my last slide, which is an addition that I don't talk about in the book because the Me Too era came out after the book. Funny thing about this oldest of behaviors is there's a lot of new things going on that I don't really quite deal with, even though the book has only been out a year, right? How do we think about cheap sex in the era of Me Too? Thankfully, consent alone has been problematized finally. I talked about consent, and I think the age of consent will not be enforced nearly so much in the future as it has been. But thankfully, consent has been, by itself, has been problematized, right? There's more required than mere consent. But will a cartel of women reemerge? Meaning women who have each other's backs and who wish to command collectively a higher price from men in their lives. I think it's unlikely because nothing about the Me Too movement has altered the mating market at all. Nothing about it has changed that, right? I think the most you'll hear about is Hollywood women complaining about gender gap in pay. That might work, right? It's social media driven, so this one's had a long life actually so far. I'm surprised, right? Most of these things don't seem to last. I would like to see it last in some aspects of it, but I'm not convinced that it will. Now, on the flip side, will it spell a new dark ages between men and women? I doubt it because there's not a whole lot that really keeps men and women from being together. Those small shifts can affect the market, right? If you pull 5% of the men out of the market because they're scared of sending wrong signals to women, 5% is a significant number. That changes things. So it may make certain kinds of dating, but I think it might change how people approach their first dates, but will it change how people approach third dates and fourth dates? Probably not. All right, my time is run out, so I'm going to stop there, and I think we have time for questions for a while. Thanks. If you go forward